The bell above the diner door rang sharp and clear, slicing through the morning chatter like a blade. Coffee cups froze halfway to mouths. Forks hovered midair, heavy with scrambled eggs. A hush rippled across the room as if someone had pressed pause on life itself. In the doorway stood a woman. A black woman, her uniform crisp, her posture straight as an arrow. She carried herself with a quiet strength that turned the heads of everyone inside. But instead of respect, what greeted her was suspicion. Eyes narrowed, lips curled. Conversations died in the back of throats. The hum of the jukebox, the clinking of silverware, even the hiss of the coffee machine seemed to fade beneath the weight of silence. At the far end of the room, a booth of white men stirred. They weren't just customers, they were a pack, the kind that fed off each other's cruelty. One of them leaned back, his boots on the seat, his smirk spreading like oil across water. He slammed his hand against the table, the sound exploding through the diner. "You're not welcome here," he barked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "This is a white-only diner." His words weren't just meant for her, they were meant for everyone. A reminder of lines drawn in hate, lines meant to cage and humiliate. The woman didn't flinch, not an inch. Her face remained unreadable, carved from stone. Without a word, she stepped forward, one foot after another, slow and steady, each stride landing like the beat of a drum. The rhythm echoed through the wooden floorboards, filling the silence with a power all its own. Murmurs rose from the tables around her, whispers laced with fear, curiosity, and shame. The men in the booth laughed, the sound harsh, scraping, meant to cut her down before she even reached the counter. "You heard me," the leader sneered, his voice louder now, desperate to prove his dominance. "Get out." He spit the last two words like poison, his eyes narrowing as if daring her to resist. Around him, his gang snickered, their laughter hollow and ugly. One elbowed the other, pointing at her with mockery, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of a performance. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about power, about showing everyone in the room who controlled the script. But the woman. She gave them nothing, not anger, not fear, nothing. She walked as if their words had no weight, as if the floor beneath her belonged to her alone, as if dignity itself had taken human form and entered that diner. The camera of imagination lingers on her face, calm, unreadable, her eyes sharp but distant. She reaches the counter, her back still straight, her movements deliberate, her silence unbroken. The hush in the room grows unbearable, the tension pulling tighter with every passing second. You could hear the buzz of a fly near the window. You could hear the air itself shifting. The whole diner waited for her to crack, for her to fight back or back down. But she did neither. She placed her hands lightly on the counter, her fingers steady, her voice finally breaking the silence. And when it did, it was not a shout. It was not a plea. It was steady, clear. A voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "Coffee," she said. Nothing more, nothing less. Coffee. The word cut through the hostility like a razor, simple, ordinary. Yet in that moment, it was a declaration, a refusal to be erased, a refusal to be moved. The leader at the booth let out a loud laugh, shaking his head, the sound desperate now, as if trying to claw back control of the moment. But something shifted, something subtle. The diners around them shifted too. Some turned away, ashamed of their silence. Others stared, unable to look anywhere else. And the men at the booth, they laughed. But beneath their laughter, a flicker of unease began to spark. Because this wasn't the reaction they expected. This wasn't fear. This wasn't surrender. This was something else entirely. Something they couldn't quite name, but something that unsettled them. The woman stood there, still as a mountain, her order hanging in the air. Every second stretched, long and heavy, like the pause before thunder. She didn't look at the gang. She didn't acknowledge their existence. And that, their sudden irrelevance, was the deepest wound of all. Because power like theirs thrived on attention, on reaction, on proof they could bend another soul. And here was a woman who denied them all of it, who stood in their hate and gave them silence in return, the kind of silence that echoed louder than any shout could. The hook was set. The storm was gathering. Everyone in that diner could feel it in their bones. Who was she? Why did she not break? And why, despite their jeers and their threats, did it feel as if the room itself had shifted around her? The men thought they held power, but power is fragile. Power can turn in an instant, And in that moment, with nothing but silence and a single word, coffee, she was already beginning to take it from them. The gang didn't stay seated for long. Their leader pushed his chair back with a screech that grated against the diner floor. The sound turned heads, but no one dared move. He rose slowly, puffing out his chest, and swaggered forward. His boots thudded like a warning drum. His friends followed, circling, the way wolves close in on a single target. One whistled, a high mocking tune meant to slice the air. Another blocked her path, leaning his body forward, towering as though his shadow alone could force her to shrink. Their eyes burned with cruelty. Their mouths dripped with venom. "You think you belong here?" one hissed. "This town don't want your kind." The waitress froze behind the counter. Her hands shook, her eyes darting from the men to the woman. She wanted to speak. You could see it on her face, but fear locked her throat. Fear of what those men might do. Fear of what the others might say if she dared to take a stand. So she did what so many do when faced with injustice. She stood still, silent, trapped between decency and survival. Around the diner, customers bowed their heads into their plates, pretending the scene wasn't unfolding right in front of them. A man coughed into his napkin. A mother tugged her child closer. Forks scraped against plates, trying to fill the silence, but failing. The air itself grew heavy with cowardice. The smell of grease, of frying bacon and bitter coffee, couldn't mask the stench of complicity. The woman sat at the counter, her back straight, her shoulders unbending, her gaze locked ahead. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She didn't acknowledge the men snarling around her. Her silence was sharp, sharper than their insults, sharper than their fists could ever. When that silence cut them, you could see it in their eyes. They wanted her broken. They wanted her scared. But she gave them nothing. Nothing but dignity. Her refusal to bend fanned their anger. The leader leaned in, his breath hot, his smirk twisted with arrogance. "I said leave, girl." He spat, his voice a low growl. Then louder for all to hear. "Before we make you." The words were a threat, a promise of humiliation, a challenge he thought she could never answer. Chairs scraped as his friends shifted, preparing to corner her. One slammed a fist against the counter, making the sugar jars rattle. Another laughed cruelly, the sound bouncing off the tiled walls like a jeer from history itself. The entire diner seemed to tilt, the weight of the moment pressing down. You could feel it, every second tightening like a rope around the room, and yet she sat, still, calm. Her silence spoke volumes, louder than any scream. It was the silence of ancestors who had stood before mobs, the silence of generations who had carried dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. She was not pleading for space. She was claiming it, and though the men didn't see it yet, that silence was her weapon. The tension was unbearable now. The waitress clutched her apron, eyes wide with terror. A young boy near the door peeked over his father's arm, watching, learning what hate looks like. The jukebox clicked, ready to change songs, then stopped, as if even the machine held its breath. Outside, a car drove past, its tires crunching gravel, then faded away, leaving nothing but the sound of heavy breathing inside the diner. The leader leaned closer, his face inches from hers. His smirk was a mask, but his eyes betrayed unease, because deep down, something about her silence unsettled him. Something about the way she sat, unshaken, unmoved, made him feel small. But pride is a dangerous thing, and pride doesn't back down easily. So he pushed harder, his voice rising, his words like venom. "Don't make me say it again. You don't belong here. And if you don't get up, we'll drag you out ourselves." The threat lingered in the air, thick and poisonous. Everyone waited for her to respond. To fight, to crumble, to give them the show they wanted. But instead she breathed, just a slow, steady breath. And in that breath was power. In that breath was defiance. The diner had become more than a room. It had become a stage where cruelty strutted, bold and arrogant. A stage where silence sat center, steady as stone, and the question hung in the air, who would break first? Them or her? What no one in that diner knew, what not even the gang could see, was that the woman carried something far heavier than their threats, something that lived in her past, something forged in fire, in battle, in sacrifice. Her silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of discipline. The kind only soldiers know. The kind that doesn't bend under insults. The kind that waits, that calculates, that strikes only when the time is right. And though they mocked her now, though they circled like hyenas around a lioness, the storm they had awakened was far greater than they could ever imagine. The leader's hand twitched. He wanted to end the silence with force, to make the moment his again. He reached out, fingers curling as though grabbing her arm would prove everything he had just spat into the air. But his hand never made it froze. Because before his skin could touch hers, she finally spoke. Her voice was low, calm, steady. Only 3 words. Careful who you touch. Not shouted. Not screamed. Just spoken like a fact. Yet the sound carried across the diner like thunder rolling through a valley. The kind of thunder you feel in your bones before you ever hear it in your ears. The men paused. The laughter died. The room shifted. It was as if the air itself had changed weight. She rose from the stool with the patience of someone who had nothing to fear. Slowly, deliberately. Her jacket fell back as she stood, and for the first time, something glimmered in the neon light of the diner's sign. The insignia, a patch embroidered on her sleeve. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. Whispers cut through the silence. One voice cracked, "She's military." Another gasped, too stunned to finish the thought. The smirk slipped from the men's faces, replaced by flickers of confusion. The certainty they had worn like armor began to crack. She hadn't moved fast. She hadn't raised a hand. She hadn't even raised her voice. But that emblem, glowing faintly under the buzzing lights, spoke louder than 1,000 speeches. The leader tried to scoff, but it didn't land. His mouth moved, but his eyes darted away, betraying him. Because he knew. Deep down he knew what that patch meant. It meant discipline. It meant strength. It meant a woman who had stood in places that men like him could never even imagine. And yet she wasn't finished. Her hand slipped into her pocket. The gang stiffened. Some thought she was reaching for a weapon. For the first time, fear flashed across their faces. But what she pulled out wasn't a gun. It was a small case, worn from use, the kind that fit neatly in the palm of a hand. She opened it with the same calm that had carried her into this diner. And inside, it wasn't a weapon of destruction. It was a weapon of truth, a metal, silver catching the neon glow, gleaming with the kind of light that silence cannot ignore. The gasps were louder this time. The whispers spread like wildfire. "That's a medal of valor." Someone breathed. Heads turned, eyes widened, the weight of history pressing down on the room. She held it steady, not flaunting it, not brandishing it, but simply letting it exist. Proof of battles fought. Proof of sacrifices made. Proof of courage so deep that men who hid behind their laughter could never measure it. She spoke again. Her words sharp, deliberate, each syllable like a blade cutting through arrogance. "I bled for this country. I fought for your freedom. And you dare tell me I don't belong here?" Her voice didn't rise, but the power in it made every person in that diner feel smaller. Even the walls seemed to lean in, listening. Even the lights seemed to burn brighter, illuminating the truth that could no longer be ignored. The leader opened his mouth, but no sound came. His friends shifted in their seats, suddenly restless. The swagger was gone. The cocky smirks had evaporated. And what was left? Men who barked like wolves, now standing exposed as trembling dogs. For the first time they couldn't meet her eyes. For the first time they looked at the floor, their boots suddenly fascinating, because dignity has a weight, and in that moment she carried all of it. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the silence of cowardice. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of realization, the silence of shame creeping into hearts too small to admit it, the silence of power shifting, tilting, collapsing, because everything they thought they owned, this diner, this town, this power to decide who belongs, slipped from their grasp the second she opened that case. The woman closed it softly, as if sealing the truth back into its resting place. She didn't need to wave it around. She didn't need to shout. The point had already been carved into the room like a scar. She placed it back into her pocket, calm, controlled, dignified, and she looked at them, not with hatred, not with rage, but with something far more devastating. With pity. Because the cruelest thing you can give a man who thrives on fear is not anger. It's not violence. It's the realization that you are beyond him. That his hate cannot reach you. That his power is nothing compared to your dignity. And as she stood there, metal tucked away, shoulders straight, eyes steady, that's exactly what she gave them. The gang shifted again, but now their movements were clumsy. Their hands twitched. Their eyes flickered to the door. The leader tried one last smirk, but it faltered before it ever reached his lips. He looked around, hoping for support, but the room wasn't his anymore. The customers who had bowed their heads in shame now stared at him with disgust. The waitress who had trembled now stood taller, watching the woman with a new kind of awe. The power he thought he owned was gone, handed back to the one who had claimed it without even raising her voice. For the first time that morning, the men realized the truth. They weren't the predators here. They weren't the wolves. They were small. They were exposed. They were nothing more than shadows cowering in the presence of someone who had earned her light. And the woman, she didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to explain. She had already said everything that needed saying, with a single medal, with a single sentence. With the strength of silence that refused to bend, the room stood still. Not the frozen stillness of fear, but the heavy stillness of realization. The men who had strutted into this moment with swagger now stood hollow. Their laughter dried up in their throats. Their smirks collapsed under the weight of what they had just witnessed. They shifted their boots against the tile floor, but every scrape echoed like defeat. The silence pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. For the first time, their voices didn't matter. For the first time, the room belonged to her. One of the younger men glanced at the door, his eyes darting like a trapped animal searching for an escape. Another rubbed his hands together, his knuckles suddenly pale. The leader, the man who had barked the loudest, who had slammed the table and spat his words with venom, stood there with his mouth tight, his jaw clenched. But even he couldn't hold her gaze. Not anymore. His eyes dropped to the floor, his voice swallowed by shame. Around the diner, something shifted in the customers. The very people who had bowed their heads earlier, hiding behind plates of eggs and cups of coffee, now raised their eyes. One by one, slowly, hesitantly. A man in a suit adjusted his tie, guilt creeping across his face. A mother pulled her child closer, not out of fear this time, but out of regret for the lesson she had almost let her child witness unchecked. An old man set down his fork, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his own silence. They all rose, not to fight, not to cheer, but to acknowledge, to bear witness to the dignity standing at the counter. The waitress stepped forward, her hands trembling but her resolve growing with every step. She carried a cup steaming, the coffee rich and dark, her lips pressed together, her eyes soft with apology. She set it down gently before the woman. Her voice cracked but carried, "On the house." Those 3 words, spoken with trembling humility, rippled through the room louder than the jeers had minutes earlier. Respect had replaced fear, and shame had replaced hate. The gang, humiliated, began to retreat, not with the confidence of men in control, but with the stumbles of those exposed for what they were. They shuffled backward, bumping into tables, muttering excuses even they didn't believe. Their boots thudded against the floor in uneven rhythm, each step echoing like the retreat of soldiers who had lost a battle they thought they couldn't lose. By the time they reached the door, their swagger was gone. Their power was gone. Their very presence was gone. And the silence they left behind was louder than their cruelty had ever been. She didn't watch them leave. She didn't need to. Their exit was not her victory. Her victory had already been sealed long before they stumbled toward the door. She reached into her pocket, tucking the medal back where it belonged, as if to remind the room that her dignity was not for display, but for living. She sat down once again, her posture unchanged, her calm unbroken. The cup of coffee steamed before her, the simple drink she had asked for from the very beginning. She lifted it to her lips, took a sip, and set it down without a word. No gloating, no speech, no need for vindication. Her dignity spoke for itself, the kind of dignity that can only be earned through fire and sacrifice. The kind of dignity that no insult, no threat, no pack of men could ever take away. The customers looked at her differently now. Some with admiration, some with shame, but all with recognition. They had witnessed something they could not unsee. They had witnessed a mirror held up to their own silence. They had witnessed courage standing in the face of hate and never bending. And the lesson hung heavy in the air, undeniable, unforgettable. Respect is not given by skin color. Respect is not handed out by wealth or titles or threats. Respect is earned through courage, earned through honor, earned through the strength to stand tall when the world tries to break you down. That morning in a small diner, hate collided with dignity, and dignity won. But the story doesn't end in that room, because everyone who sat in silence that day carried something out with them. A reminder, a scar, a lesson. That silence in the face of injustice is not neutral. It is a choice. That dignity, even when tested, shines brighter than cruelty. That a single act of courage, a single refusal to bend, can flip the balance of power in an instant. The woman didn't need applause. She didn't need thanks. She had already carried heavier burdens than anyone in that diner could imagine. She knew what it meant to fight for freedom. She knew what it meant to sacrifice for strangers who might never know her name. She didn't enter the diner to prove herself. She entered for a cup of coffee. But what she left behind was a story, a parable, a truth carved into the walls of that diner forever. And as the sunlight streamed through the window, catching the steam rising from her cup, the world outside kept moving. Cars drove past. A dog barked in the distance. Life continued as it always does. But inside, for those who had witnessed, nothing would ever be quite the same. Because once you see dignity win against hate, once you see courage rise against cruelty, you cannot unsee it. That morning, she walked into a diner and was told she didn't belong. She walked out having proven the opposite, not with fists, not with rage, but with silence, with honor, with the weight of a medal tucked in her pocket. And though the men left with shame in their steps, she left with the same thing she had carried all along, dignity. And the truth remains for us all, echoing beyond that small diner. When hate demands you bow, the greatest victory is to stand. When hate demands you bow, the greatest victory is to stand.